Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here this afternoon to talk about, as the Senator said, a very important topic. And I want to start by not only thanking you all for being here, but also the Nebraska Family Alliance, the Nebraska Catholic Conference, and Protect Nebraska Children, a grassroots group that has organized to oppose these standards. They all work to help get the word out. And then, of course, thank you very much to Sarah Moser and Sarah Bosselman for being here today as well. And then after I speak, we're going to have a UNK professor, Greg Brown, who has been speaking about these types of topics nationally, actually, come up and talk a little bit from the perspective of an academic view about why these things are non-science. And that is part of the problem with all these standards, is that the specific ones we're talking about in human growth and development are interjecting non-scientific, controversial, in some cases inaccurate, and in some cases things that parents want to deal with on their own topics into education. Now, while there are parts of these health standards that are good, they talk about nutrition, they talk about substance abuse prevention, the specific things we're talking about here today have to do with human growth and development, and specifically around sex education. And so what I thought I'd do is start off with a little bit of history and background on this, and then move into the standards themselves specifically, and then really what you all can do to help push back on these standards and why it's so important. And maybe one of the reasons why I want to hit upon first is it's important to know that the Department of Education does not report to me as governor. They report to a separately elected board called the State Board of Education. There are 8 members of the State Board of Education. Your representative here in Columbus is Patty Googles. You can find your state board if you're not from this district. If you if you go to education.ne.gov, education.ne.gov, you can find all the state board members by district, the contact information and so forth, so that if you're not from the Columbus area and it's not Patty Googles, you can find whoever it is. And I think it's important to note what Karen said as well, that not one single member of the State Board of Education has made a public statement about these standards. Not one. It's also important to note that, as I mentioned, they're a publicly elected board. 4 were elected last year. 4 more will be elected next year. So these are elected officials that are accountable to you, the voters, directly. They're not accountable to me as the governor. They don't report to me. They're accountable to you. And they're the ones that direct the Nebraska Department of Education in what the Nebraska Department of Education is going to pursue. And that's, again, why it's so important that you, as parents and grandparents, get involved and get engaged. Because they're only going to change what they are doing if they hear from parents. Because they're not going to listen to me, because they don't report to me, but they do report to you. And that's why it's so important that you all get involved. Now, let's talk about that for a second, because we talked about parents. Nebraska actually has a relationship directly with this precedent in law that parents are directly responsible for their child's education. They are the primary people who are responsible for educating their kids and can direct their child's education in the way they want and direct the way they want, what religion to raise them in as it dictates their conscience. And it goes back to 1923. Here in Nebraska, we had a law that you could not teach kids in a foreign language. Robert Meyer was a teacher in Hampton and wanted to teach kids the Bible in German, and was convicted of breaking that Nebraska law and took it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that conviction and upheld that parents are primarily responsible for their kids' education and can direct it in a way that they see fit. Parents. Now, I think it's also important because if you look at who is opposing this, it's parents. We have seen hundreds of parents show up to to the school board or the State Board of Education meetings to share their concerns about these sex education standards. We believe hundreds, if not thousands more, are sending comments to the State Board of Education on this. If you look at the Nebraska Family Alliance, the Nebraska Catholic Conference, and you look at their materials, it is directed toward parents. Who's pushing this on the other side? Advocates, not parents. If you go look at, for example, the Women's Fund for Omaha, one of the groups that's pushing these sex education standards, at the top it says advocate communication. This is an agenda that's being pushed by advocates. In fact, that's part of the history of comprehensive sex education. It's rooted in the abortion industry. It was actually the medical director for Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Dr. Mary Calderon, who originally started this process of coming up with comprehensive sex education. She created an organization called Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States, otherwise known as SECUS. And this group, SECUS, in 1991, published their comprehensive sex education standards that they wanted pushed on all the school districts. And in fact, just last year they updated it. And if you look at what is written in the Human Growth and Development Standards that have been put out there, it is, in many cases, lifted almost verbatim from these SECUS standards, being pushed by the advocates, by being pushed by the abortion industry, being pushed by Planned Parenthood. So that is where the foundation of this push comes from. Because people have asked me, why are they doing it? Where is this coming from? And so digging into a little further, we found out that this group SECUS is the one who started pushing this back in 1991, and that the language in our document is lifted almost verbatim from it. I'm actually going to get back to that a little bit later. So we know that parents are responsible, the advocates are pushing this. What about the Department of Education? Well, actually, there is no statutory requirement for the Department of Education to do sex education standards. In fact, just the opposite. The requirements in statute for the Nebraska Department of Education, it's actually, if we look at the statute, it's 79-760-01, requires the Department of Education to create standards around reading, writing, math, science, and social studies. It does not require it for sex education. Now, the Department of Education has created standards in other areas, like world languages. But there's no requirement for them to do it. They're doing this because they're being pushed by the advocates and doing it on their own accord. In fact, the legislature twice within the last decade has specifically declined to make sex education a part of the standards the Department of Education has to create standards around. In 2013, Senator Ken Harr introduced LB 619 to require the Department of Education to create sex education standards. That bill was opposed and ultimately killed on the floor of the legislature. Then again in 2015, Kate Sullivan, who was chair of the Education Committee, introduced LR 334, which was an interim study to study comprehensive sex education in our schools. There was so much opposition to it that no legislation came from that interim study. So I see this as an end run around the legislature. The State Board of Education is trying to go around specifically the legislature on a topic the legislature has taken up and decided that they do not want the Department of Education creating standards around. They're trying to go around the legislature. And so in March, they published these standards. Now, in these standards, they talk about a lot of things that I mentioned earlier about being non-scientific. Just let me share with you a few. Karen shared a few. Starting in kindergarten, They talk about family structures. But as Karen mentioned, they don't mention the family structure I came from, a traditional family, mom and dad, heterosexual relationship. Nowhere to be found. In first grade, they introduced the non-scientific topic of gender identity. In third grade, sexual orientation. In fourth grade, they want our fourth graders to compare sexual orientation and gender identity, comparing and contrasting. They also introduced the topic that gender is assigned at birth, and therefore a social construct. And folks, that is biologically, scientifically, factually untrue. Your sex is determined at the moment of conception, based upon your parents' DNA. So these standards themselves are containing things that are flawed. They're just wrong. They're trying to teach kids things that are just not true. In fifth grade, they talk about the non-scientific topic again, that gender identity exists along a spectrum. In sixth grade, they talk about topics such as cisgender, transgender, non-binary, two-spirit. And then in seventh grade, they want to teach 12-year-olds about anal and oral sex. Folks, these standards are sexualizing our children. I talked to one pediatrician who told me this is grooming 101. And in fact, getting back to those SECA standards I talked to you about before, if you go look at the SECA standards, they actually talk about teaching second graders about gender identity, not first graders. They talk about sexual orientation in fifth grade, not third and fourth. They talk about teaching kids anal and oral sex in eighth grade, not seventh. The standards that are put in today that they propose are more radical than the ones that even SECA has proposed. If you can believe it. And that's why these standards need to be scrapped. There is no fixing them. This is an agenda that is being pushed by advocates. These topics properly belong to parents and school boards and superintendents to decide how to handle those at the local school district level. We must respect that families are going to take different approaches about how they want to handle these topics, and that kids don't develop at the same rate. And so parents will want to take a different approach at different times with different kids about these topics. This is not something that the State Board of Education is required to do, and it's not something they should be. And that's why it's so important that we push back and stop this now. Now, as I mentioned before, the State Board doesn't report to me. I don't have the ability to get them to change the standards, but you do. And this is where we need parents to get involved. It starts with go to education.ne.gov and read the standards for yourself. It starts with read the standards. You'll find them there. You can focus just on the human growth and development portion. It's done by grade level. And you will be shocked by the things that you read in there, the things that I've just laid out. Then, the second step is contact the State Board of Education. Again, you can find that at education.ne.gov. If you go search, you'll be able to find your State Board member. I think we got Patty Boobles here, don't we? Let's see. Can you put up Patty's? There we go. It's not really coming in very close. Can you scoot it over a little bit so we at least see your contact information there?
Oops, here we go.
Good. Yep. There we go. So if you can read that, that's got her contact information right there, her phone number, her email address. Again, this is all on the website for the State Board of Education. You can you can't take these maps off, there's the districts there. So contact your State Board of Education member. If Patty's not your State Board of Education member, you can go search it there on the website, get the same contact information for your State Board of Education member. Send them an email. The Department of Education also has an email address to send up so that you can send comments into them. And that's nde.standardsinput@nebraska.gov. nde.standardinputs@nebraska.gov. So again, read the standards, contact your State Board of Education member, and then send an email in to the Department of Education. That's the first thing to do, to be able to let them know how you feel about these standards and share your concerns. Then you can also reach out to your local school board. That's what Marion was talking about. Our state senators, 30 of them, signed a letter supporting a resolution to take to local school boards and get school boards to pass resolutions opposing these standards. That's another way to demonstrate to the state board there's a grassroots opposition to these standards. And you can find that resolution. I think we got handouts in the back that we had them. We were also on the Nebraska Family Alliance's website, the Catholic Conference's website, and also we will be posting them on my website, governor.nebraska.gov, within a couple of days. But I want to thank the senators for supporting that resolution. Again, 30 of our 49 senators. And we had 28 senators who actually signed on to the original letter opposing these standards. So you can see that a large majority of the legislature opposes the Nebraska Department of Education doing these standards. And that's one of the reasons why I say they're trying to go around the legislature. So it's important for you to contact the state board, but also you can contact your local school boards and work that way. So that's another way that you can get involved. Third thing, support your state senators. As they are going through this process, as they are trying to oppose this, reach out to their offices. Let them know you're on their side, that you will appreciate the work that they're doing, standing up to this agenda that's being pushed by advocates, not by parents. So thank them. Let them know that you got their back. Then, let's see, also go to governor.nebraska.gov and sign up for updates so that you can find out what's going on. And we'll keep you updated as this changes, because this is just the first draft. They're planning on coming back with another draft. They are trying to get this all, their original schedule is trying to get this all done by the fall, because what they want to do is get it passed this fall so that school districts will start adopting it in the fall of 2022. That's what we're trying to stop. So we've got the course of this summer and into the fall to get this stopped. One of my concerns is that they're going to come back and try and water down the standards. We need to have these standards scrapped. There's no fixing it. Just take it out. There's no fixing it. And then finally, another thing that you can do as parents and grandparents is contact your local schools and find out what is the curriculum currently being taught to kids. Find out what your opt-out standards are. So under Nebraska law, you as parents, again, remember, parents are primarily responsible for kids' education. You can opt your kids out of sex education if you don't agree with the topics that they're teaching. Schools have different policies they write on this. So reach out to your schools, understand what the curriculum is. Find out what the opt-out standards are. And know there's a difference between these standards and the ultimate curriculum that's being taught in schools. The curriculum is actually what the teachers are responsible directly for teaching. The standards just are a high level of what the topics they want taught are. So it's important that as parents, you know what the curriculum is that your kids are being taught. So those are some of the things that you can do to make sure that you know what's going on with regard to the sex education standards. I just want to hit one more thing before I bring Greg up here as well. And that is, Karen pointed out this was a flawed process. And she's absolutely right. It was driven by advocates. So when they put together their writers and their advisors, they invited a group called, for example, Out Nebraska, which is an LGBTQ political advocacy group. They didn't allow the Catholic Conference to be a part of the group. They didn't talk my chief medical officer. They didn't ask anybody on the Public Board of Health to be a part of this process. So they left out mainstream groups while bringing in advocate groups to write this. And one key thing that was missing was the voice of parents. But now you have your chance. This is where the voice of parents needs to be heard. So please, reach out to the State Board of Education, reach out to your local school board, let them know you oppose these standards, find out what the curriculum is, and continue to stay involved, engaged, support your state senators. We got to continue to make sure that the State Board of Education knows they need to scrap these standards, that fixing them is not an option, and if they take that off the table before they get around to passing anything in the fall. And with it now, I'd like to actually bring up Greg Brown to talk a little bit more about these sex ed standards. As I mentioned, he's a UNK professor who teaches exercise science and has been a speaker nationally on different topics like this. So please give Greg more welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm standing over here at the podium because I'm a little more comfortable here. I want to thank Governor Ricketts for the invitation to be here today. I really appreciate it, so thank you, Governor. I also appreciate the Nebraska Family Alliance, the Catholic Conference. I appreciate the senators for being here for their time. I want to say thanks to my wife, Amber, for coming up here with me, also keeping company in the car, making so I don't fall asleep. As Governor Ricketts said, my name is Greg Brown. I'm a professor at UNK. Since 2004, I've helped to educate some of Nebraska's teachers, coaches, and future health professionals in the areas of human anatomy, human physiology, nutrition, and research methods. I'm also a husband, I'm a father, I'm an uncle, I'm a friend, and I'm a concerned Nebraskan. In my opinion, these proposed sex education standards are not age appropriate. For example, children in kindergarten do not need to learn characteristics relating to identity and sexuality. Children in first grade do not need to define gender identity and gender role stereotypes. Middle school age children do not need classroom lessons about oral and anal sex. In my opinion, the proposed standards aren't science-based either. For example, fifth graders should not learn about the potential role of hormone blockers on young people who identify as transgender. First off, puberty blockers are not approved for use by the FDA for transgender children. Puberty blockers were actually developed for men with prostate cancer, and they're using these in children, all right? The research on puberty blockers is very, very slim. As far as showing long-term effects, we don't know the long-term effects of using puberty blockers in children. And what little research that exists really doesn't support that they help these children with mental health issues. And so that's very, very concerning. And these are just a few of the examples from the proposed sex education standards that are neither age appropriate nor science-based. It seems to me that the proposed standards seek to indoctrinate our children about things that are diametrically opposed to conservative family values. I would encourage you to follow Governor Ricketts' advice on voicing your concerns. Contact the members of the Board of Education. Tell them who you are, tell them where you're from, and tell them why you oppose these standards. Contact your state senators. Tell them the same thing, who you are, where you're from, why you oppose these standards. Talk to your local school board. Talk to your friends and your neighbors and your family members. There's about 22,000 people that live in Columbus. I'm eyeballing it here, about 140 people here, right? So there's a lot of people you can talk to and tell them why you're concerned about these proposed standards. Talk to the teachers that you know. The teachers I know don't want to teach these standards. One of the things that really concerns me with these standards, if they are approved by the Department of Education, then college and university faculty will need to teach to these standards to future health educators. And then you'll have people graduating from college thinking that is what should be taught. So we don't need these standards from that point of view either. Make sure you know the material on these proposed sex education standards. Send letters to the editor, to the Columbus Telegram, send it to the Lincoln Journal-Star, send it to the Omaha World Herald, send it to any newspaper you know of. Send them letters to the editor saying why you oppose these standards. Another thing, as the governor has said, is make sure you're informed about what's going on, right? There's a second draft that is supposed to be coming out, but they might be just as bad as this draft. They might just use different wording. These efforts to sexualize our children have been ongoing, and they're going to continue. So we can't just have this a one and done type of thing. We need to stay involved, not just through the fall to see what happens with these standards, but for the future. Stay informed about what our children are being taught, what is being proposed for our children to be taught, because it's going to take a long-term effort to make sure and prevent these things being taught in the schools. Once again, I just want to thank Governor Ricketts for inviting me here. Thank all of you for being here. I know you would rather hear from Governor Ricketts than from me, so I'll turn the time back over to him for some questions and answers.